and I agree with those of you who believe that I was mistaken in proposing Cecilia Frobisher as a member of the Order of the Phoenix. Albus Dumbledore glanced round the kitchen of 12, Grimmauld Place, looking at each wizard in turn as the murmurs and whispers filled the room. The sentence caught most of the wizards off guard. Most had been called to the meeting following a grueling double order shift, or were about to go on one, in order to discuss the plans for the battle. It had been a long and difficult night and morning with a good deal of things to have to concentrate on. Many were half listening now, registering the updates that followed the battle plan passively as the weak February morning invaded the kitchen. They were not really expecting Dumbledore to close with such a statement, and the whispers amongst them were of dazed realization. Over the rising din, one wizard was trying to make himself heard, resorting to pulling out his wand to gain Dumbledore's attention so that he could speak. Dumbledore raised his hand to request quiet. Once the room was still, Alastor Moody stepped forward. "I don't think that's the case, Dumbledore," he said, his mad eye swiveling in all directions as he spoke. "The evidence alone suggests what she has endured to bring us the results she has would defeat most people, and yet she has shown a good deal of resilience and bravery. Are you denying this?" Moody thumped his walking stick hard on the floor to emphasize his question, making most of the wizards jump. "No, to be sure," said Dumbledore to Moody, looking in the direction of the nods and shuffles. "Indeed, were she not involved, we would not have made the gains we have, as you quite rightly point out. However, her well-being," Moody looked at Dumbledore uncomprehendingly. "Then I do not understand the problem," growled Moody. "She is the right man for the job." "She is a mole, Moody," said Sirius from behind him, and Moody's eye swiveled round, fixing Sirius' black look, as did many of the other members. He looked grudgingly towards the wall. "I do not disagree with you, Alastor," continued Dumbledore, looking at Sirius. "However, what is clear is that she is under pressure, a great deal of pressure in her pursuit of perfection with regard to Harry's health, and that drove her to her departure 2 nights ago." "That and the lad himself," muttered Moody darkly. Dumbledore looked in his direction before continuing. "It is for this reason and no other that I am inclined to agree that I was." He looked down at a piece of parchment in his hand, barking mad to admit her. A wizard on the front row looked down and began to turn red. "I have received correspondence from many of you, and for those that laud Mrs. Frobisher's actions there are an equal number of those who say they will not remain a member of the Order if she remains. Therefore," he paused, engaging each and every wizard in the room by eye, "I require you to vote. You are to vote on whether she should remain." The murmurs and whispers began again as the Order members whispered amongst themselves. Dumbledore raised a hand to call for quiet again. "Your vote should consider 2 things, that Cecilia Frobisher remains in the Order, thus allowing Harry the best chance he has with the potion. Should you vote for her expulsion, if she is to go, then the chances of the potion succeeding are slim." He paused, looking at each of the wizards, now perfectly silent, before continuing this time. "The Order cannot function with only half our number, so by voting, you are consenting to the majority verdict." He sat down, allowing the wizards to talk until the discussion petered out of its own accord. When it had, Dumbledore got to his feet again. "Therefore I propose that until Harry's potion is ready, Cecilia Frobisher remain a member of the Order of the Phoenix." "I will second that." Minerva McGonagall got to her feet. "Excuse me." The wizards turned to see who had interrupted. Remus Lupin had his hand aloft. "You may have time to consider it, Remus," said Dumbledore softly. Remus shook his head. "I wanted to ask a question." He fixed his eyes forward as he spoke. Dumbledore nodded. "Does Cecilia know we are voting on her future here this morning?" He continued to stare at Dumbledore, awaiting an answer. The room was silent as the rest of the wizards waited too. "No," he replied. I did not wish to further burden her further. Without turning to acknowledge the comments around him, Remus nodded briefly. Are there any other questions? Yes? Arthur? From his inscription of the meeting's minutes, Arthur Weasley raised his head, and nodded at Dumbledore. Can I ask why? Dumbledore smiled at Arthur as he lowered the minute-taking quill. I feel she has enough to deal with. Her work with Severus is vital for Harry's potion to be completed. And her witness to the events of last night was more we would expect one of us to face. She has enough to deal with, he repeated, and I believe there is a limit to the science in solving this. Above the silent roar of the assembled order, who were looking at each other in silent confusion, Sirius Black got to his feet. And you say this to us now, Dumbledore, when you allowed her to carry on? When good wizards have died on her behalf? Sirius threw his arm in the direction of Benjamin Worg's empty chair, and most of the other wizards followed his gesture. Dumbledore looked at him calmly. You misinterpret me, Sirius, said Dumbledore evenly. What she has discovered is more valuable than ever we could have achieved alone, and without her input we would not be in a position to defeat Voldemort. He began to survey the order members again, waiting for silence. Sirius returned to his chair. There is another reason. Not only do the enemy know of her existence and have accounted for her into their plans, to which under his breath Sirius whispered Snivellus, the Ministry have discovered her here. Tunks informed me of this during the night. Around him, the Irles nodded and sniffed in agreement, confirming Dumbledore's statement, or allowing his statement to confirm their own suspicions. There is a spell on the property that alerted them when Cecilia Frobisher stepped past the Do Not Trespass signs. However, she was retrieved before Befuddlers arrived to modify her memory. At his last comment, Mrs. Weasley gave her husband a glare. Therefore, concluded Dumbledore, those in favor that Mrs. Frobisher remains in the order raise your hands. At first, only 2 hands raised. Over the course of the next minute almost half of wizards in the room had raised their hands. Dumbledore surveyed them, evaluatively. 15 votes to 9, he stopped as a couple more hands waved tentatively in the air. 13 votes to, Dumbledore stopped again as another hand raised. Could those amongst us who wish Cecilia Frobisher not to remain a member please raise their hands? The wizards in the room looked at one another. 5 hands rose quickly. 5 against. How many for? This time, 13 hands rose quickly. Dumbledore nodded. 5 against, 13 for and 7 abstentions. Arthur, please note that in our minutes. He turned in the direction of Arthur Weasley, who directed the enchanted quill to inscribe Dumbledore's instructions. Sirius folded his arms, and huffed his displeasure loudly. And she is to continue to teach, Albus? Minerva turned to Dumbledore, a worried expression on her face. It is overwork that has caused much of this, I fear. Miss Granger has informed me she is worried for her state of mind. Dumbledore returned Professor McGonagall's worried expression with one of calming serenity. While I do not have to answer for whom I choose as a Mole Studies teacher, I would have many needless quill-to-parchment exercises to complete explain in greater detail a mole present were she not in the employ of the school. Therefore she must continue in her capacity of a teacher lest the battle is lost through our drowning in paperwork. Yes, Miss Banks. Can I ask you, Professor Dumbledore, of the exact nature of last night's events? Elspeth, a young Auror, not long out of Hogwarts herself, smiled nervously, addressing him in her high-pitched tone, cut with concern. It had been a long night that had dragged on into the early hours, and she had just registered what Dumbledore had said. With Professor Snape, you mean? Severus Snape was injured in line of duty. He will be returned to full health, I do not doubt. Poppy Pomfrey has his interests at heart. Elspeth nodded in confirmation, then turned her head vaguely as Sirius muttered loudly under his breath something that sounded like not just her. So in conclusion, The weapon is close at hand, and now the alert has been set. We will need every member of the Order there if victory is to be ours. Cecilia Frobisher remains an honorary member of the Order, and more details will be provided upon completion of the weapon. He smiled brightly at the very tired members. That concludes our meeting, ladies and gentlemen, and I must thank you all for taking the trouble to come at such short notice and at such hour. He looked at Bertie Griffin, who was still in his pajamas, and gave a small smile. It took a few moments before the wizards got to their feet, yawning and stretching as they went. Some went into the living room and disapparated immediately, others passed a few words to one another before disapparating too, or using the living room fireplace to flue. A couple of wizards looked over a sheaf of notes they had made, which no longer made much sense, before shrugging and maneuvering the kitchen table back to the center of the room using a variety of spells and hexes. It was a few moments before Mr. Weasley got to his feet too, looking over the minutes of the meeting before kissing Mrs. Weasley on the cheek and walking out into the living room. "No one stopping for breakfast?" inquired Molly Weasley, as she began to look at who was left in the kitchen. "Not for me," said Sirius, operating a cup of tea that began to coil hot steam from the rim. "I bet most of us just want to get back to bed." "Shame," said Mrs. Weasley, the opportunity for maternal domesticity denied her. She put down a large frying pan that she had intended to begin the breakfast in, looking crestfallen at it. "What about you, Remus?" "What, Molly?" Remus Lupin looked up from what he was reading, a copy of the Daily Prophet from the day before, an expression of confusion fleeting over his features. "Breakfast, Moony," said Sirius, swinging his feet onto the kitchen worktop and ignoring Molly Weasley's silent look of disapproval. "Molly is wondering whether you're having any." No. "Thank you, Molly," he added, looking at her and smiling. "Not really in the mood for it." Mrs. Weasley looked at the scar that cut deeply into the back of his left hand, and nodded. "I'll just see if Arthur's managed to go. Maybe you'll fancy some lunch, later?" She looked at Remus for confirmation, and he nodded silently. "You really should be looking after yourself," said Sirius, idly stirring the tea and watching the steam emanate from it erratically. "Especially at your time of the month." He glanced in Remus's direction as he spoke. Remus raised an eyebrow in response, but said nothing. "Snape is going to let her be sacrificed. You do know that? He's made a pact with the Death Eaters to save himself." Again, Sirius looked lazily in Remus's direction. This time, his comment provoked a response. "No," he replied, turning to look at Sirius. "That can't be right. How do you know?" The expression on Sirius's face betrayed him, and Remus rolled his eyes skyward. "Harry." He shook the Daily Prophet, and turned over the page. "Well, I suppose that's all you have to do if you're shut up in here." "I'm still speaking to Harry, if that's what you mean," continued Sirius, staring out of the kitchen window at the slowly paling early morning sun. Remus said nothing and continued to read the third paragraph of the second column in quiet contemplation. Sirius watched him for a few moments before taking a sip of his well-sugared tea. "Where were you a few days ago, anyway?" "Around," replied Remus, turning over the page of the Prophet again and examining an advertisement for Bouts the Potion Maker. "Yourself?" He raised an eyebrow in Sirius's direction. "Around. Which is more than can be said for Tonks, I see." "No indeed," confirmed Remus carefully. Silence reigned for a few minutes as Sirius sipped his tea again and watched a small cloud pass over the face of the morning sun, and Remus looked at the Prophet's Switch weekly column. "She's still on duty, then," added Sirius. "I assume so. And you've gone to the Forbidden Forest alone, this month then?" "Yes, Sirius." "And you are out of Wolfsburn?" "Yes indeed. The only person with the ability to make it for me is incapacitated at the moment." More silence ensued, save for the rustle of the newspaper and the clink of the cup on the saucer. If she has to be sacrificed for the greater good, surely that's the best thing for everyone. Sirius uncrossed his legs at the ankle, pushing himself into a sitting position and draining his cup. Remus Lupin looked up from the Prophet's letters page and gave him a look that matched the deep wounds on the back of his hand and neck. Without saying anything, Sirius got to his feet, clicking his fingers so that the empty china cup disappeared. As he made his way towards the door, it swung open and Minerva McGonagall walked through. Sensing an atmosphere, she glanced between the two wizards, nodding in thanks as Sirius held the door for her before placing her bag on the table and sitting on the chair next to Remus. Once she had passed, Sirius walked through and into the living room without looking back. "Dumbledore is compelled to do what he thinks best in all circumstances," said Minerva, feeling inside her tartan robe and extracting a pair of spectacles. "Don't let Sirius trouble you, Remus. Mrs. Frobisher will be quite safe, I am sure." At her words, Remus put down the out-of-date paper and looked at McGonagall for a few moments. She smiled kindly at him. "It would never have worked, Minerva," he said sadly, stroking the back of his hand as it began to tighten in response to his body's healing process. "She could not have abided what I am." "But you did not tell her." "Perhaps she would have understood." The witch glanced down at the minor headline on the facing page that read, "The Ministry and the Mystery They Tried to Hide." To read the shocking truth. "No offense, Minerva, but I've been through all this with Sirius." He looked down at the headline, looking at the words as his mind recounted unbidden memories that were bubbling uncontrollably to the surface of his conscious. Not to state the obvious, Remus, but Sirius Black is not exactly objective when it comes to Mrs. Frobisher, is he? Remus Lupin exhaled and stared at the image of a wizard from the Ministry on the opposite page who was pointing in the direction of the sky after leaving the phone box that was the Ministry's mall entrance under the title "The Day the Sky Fell on My Head." Then he looked at McGonagall. "Minerva. He began, his expression one of cheerless inquiry. Just then the door flew open and Sirius looked at them both, his hand still on the door handle whence he had just opened it. "Chaps. Remus. You're needed, old friend. Red alert, I'm afraid. 88,888,888. As she crossed the first floor corridor, the first thing Cecilia noticed was the students. She noticed the students because of their puzzled looks, surprised at her presence. Not in a vindictive way certainly, but in a puzzled, curious way, as if trying to recall something important connected with her presence, but then dismissing it quickly. She had just come from Dumbledore's office where Minerva McGonagall, who had found her talking quietly to the unconscious body of Snape in the hospital wing, had sent her, ignoring Cecilia's protests about her appearance. Cecilia had explained what she'd heard the Death Eaters say the previous evening to a silent yet engaged headmaster, and he nodded and prompted her to continue from her return from Godric's Hollow to the conversation where Cecilia had realized she knew of a plan against them. When she had finished, Dumbledore had nodded in acknowledgement of her imparting of the information, confirmed that the students, with the exception of Harry, Hermione and the Weasley family, were ignorant of her departure and the circumstances surrounding it, then had merely asked whether she had what she needed to continue with the potion and that she was happy to continue as arranged. Cecilia had felt taken aback and slightly uneasy at the fact that Dumbledore had failed to ask her to justify for her absence and had nodded, sighing gratefully at the brevity of their agreement in the end as she left. It was just as well, thought Cecilia as she made her way down from the top tower and onto the moving staircases, judging the pattern of their movement so she could reach the second floor as quickly as possible, for she had hardly been able to consider anything else other than the burden of information sagging on her mind. And on top of that she could not get the image of Snape from her mind. Snape was badly hurt. That had been the first thing Cecilia had realized when she had awoken next to him. The second was that he was unconscious. She had quietly whispered his name, looking at the horrific injuries he had suffered. Then Poppy Pomfrey had spoken to her, and asked if she could add to the information that Hagrid had given to her, which had been that he had found him outside the castle grounds. She had told Cecilia that, in her opinion, he had been hit by Cruciatus Curse by more than one wizard. "I'm so worried about him, Poppy," she'd exclaimed when Madame Pomfrey had realized she was awake. He had taken so much on her account, it only seemed right she should stay. "I can see that, dear," she replied, looking diagnostically at Snape, before casting Cecilia the same look. The mole looked terrible, she had thought, and wondered what had compelled her to stay next to the most disliked teacher in the school. Who was she to put up a fuss? "Looks like a multiple hit of Cruciatus Curse to me," she'd continued, explaining why she was sure of her diagnosis. The yellowing of the skin just there. Cecilia had looked at Snape's arm, which had a slight jaundiced tinge to it. "The capillaries have been ruptured, causing slow leaching of blood. Like a bruise, but slower and more difficult to heal. Also, he is suffering from internal injuries, for there will be extensive blood loss to the major organs which would have been deprived of a blood supply for many minutes because of the rupturing. So incredibly painful," she added, taking in Cecilia's horrified expression, "but he will heal." Cecilia had smiled and nodded at Poppy Pomfrey, grateful that the healer had not made a fuss. Then she informed her of the information she had received about her grandfather, Pompops, and his relationship to Raymond Lully. Poppy seemed very pleased to know of the news, and thanked Cecilia for remembering her with so many other things she had to think about, and her own exhaustion no doubt, Poppy had reprimanded gently. Yes, Cecilia had agreed silently, she was tired. But of her decision from the night before her resolve was firm, and she found she was reveling in relatively more energy than she would have expected. However, she'd had no more time to consider the other things in the quiet environment of the hospital wing, for, just as Poppy had left her, Minerva found her and had insisted that Cecilia take her bemudded and protesting form to Dumbledore post haste. It was only during her journey from Dumbledore's office, free of apprehension of her status and position following her departure, as she walked the passages of the castle on the way back to her room, that she found herself having the mental energy to push all unnecessary and irrelevant thoughts out of her mind. So as Cecilia rounded the corner towards the teacher's quarters, her mind working on where to recommence their research, she was amazed to see Dot herself, showing Ron Weasley into her room. Ducking quickly as the door closed in front of her, Cecilia glanced through the glass of her own bedroom door window, trying to see what she was doing in her own room with a student. "Oh yes," her other self was saying, "Miss Granger told me all about it. I would advise you to speak to her, Mr. Weasley." Her other self looked up from her chair, her legs folded at the ankle in the way that Cecilia did when she was lost in thought but was being instructive, and was giving Ron Weasley, who was standing before her and listening hard, her look, of knowing wisdom. Cecilia strained to hear what was going on, and saw her other self playing with a necklace, a diamond-petaled flower on a thin chain. What was happening? Cecilia wondered as the other her refolded her ankles. Then it occurred to her, this was her room, inside were her belongings. She shouldn't have to be creeping around outside it. And walked in. She looked at herself. Her other self was sitting at her desk, leafing through what seemed to be her notebook. Cecilia stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand still holding onto the handle as she goggled at the other her. Her other self looked up. Ron looked at her, and looked at her other self, almost as much puzzlement on his face. "Look," said Cecilia, her voice rising in pitch and volume to match her rising irritability. "I don't know who you are, but I've had one hell of a last 2 days, so if you're a ghost or something, you'll be kind enough to continue your conversation, without the use of my lab notes, and out of my room." She looked at her other self and folded her arms with a gesture of finality. Ron turned to look back at her, and then her other self, whose eyes began to fill with tears. "Ron," said Cecilia, in a less brusque manner. "Perhaps you'd be so good as to explain what is going on, and why you're sitting on my bed and talking to me." Ron just looked at her for a few moments before an expression of comprehension dawned. He pointed at the other Cecilia with a shaking finger. "Polyjuice potion!" he cried angrily at her other self, glancing at Cecilia momentarily. "Whoever it is in there." He walked over to her other self and stood, hands on hips. "Who is it?" The other her began to weep steadily, screwing up Cecilia's top in the process. "We'll only have to wait another 5 minutes to find out anyway," continued Ron, his face turning red and jabbing his finger at the other Cecilia. "Harry? Ginny? Hermione?" As Ron's furious remonstrations continued, her other self began to cry harder. Cecilia turned to Ron and smiled kindly at him and gestured towards the door. "Perhaps you'd like to leave myself and I alone, Mr. Weasley?" she said, walking towards the other her and standing next to her. "Perhaps you could wait outside?" "No!" cried Ron angrily, taking a step towards the other Cecilia. "I want to see who it is who's been trying to con me for the last half an hour." He took another step towards the other Cecilia and Cecilia herself took a step forward, standing between them. "Wait outside, Mr. Weasley," said Cecilia firmly, looking in the direction of the door. "You may speak to the other me at your leisure when he or she leaves my room. In their original form." Ron looked as if he was about to argue with Cecilia, and glanced between both her and the other her in resentful annoyance. Instead he considered Cecilia's less than kempt appearance and he nodded slowly before turning and walking begrudgingly from her room. "Now," said Cecilia calmly, looking at her own red-blotched face and teary eyes, "would you like to explain what's going on here?" The figure before her erupted into heavy tears again and before her eyes, her own form materialized into Hermione Granger. The girl's body was racked with sobs as she clenched her fingers between her hair in distress. Cecilia stepped back and allowed the girl to stop crying, sitting on her own bed in her grimy clothes, which she was dying to change out of, and waited for Hermione to say something. Eventually, Hermione's fierce raging tears diminished to muffled sobs and took her hands away from her face. "Mrs. Frobisher, can you promise me something?" She turned, her red eyes in Cecilia's direction. "If I can," said Cecilia gently. She got to her feet, and moved towards Hermione, smiling at the girl. Hermione got up too and moved away from Cecilia. "Don't," said Hermione, raising a hand in Cecilia's direction. "Please don't. You need to be angry with me. That's what I deserve, not you to understand." Cecilia frowned, and folded her arms. "Tell me why you're sitting in my room pretending to be me," said Cecilia coldly, sitting back down on her own bed. Her tone took Hermione by surprise, and she sat back down on the chair by the dressing table, fiddling with the flower pendant nervously. And then she told Cecilia in great detail how she had got the idea of making Polyjuice potion to be her in October, so she could speak to Ron. How she had rediscovered the handkerchief which she had offered to Cecilia when Cecilia was originally investigating ingredients. That she originally decided to use it to get Ron to ask her out by adding it to the potion and becoming Cecilia. And how she had taken a few strands of Cecilia's hair when Ron had not done as she, Hermione, had expected. She continued to take it. Throughout the confession, Hermione delivered the information matter-of-factly. She was regretful, Cecilia noticed, however did not make excuses for her actions. At the end, Hermione apologized, looking down and placed a vial of potion onto Cecilia's desk. When Hermione finished, Cecilia said nothing. The first thing that came to mind was, why had she not investigated this potion before and as a result reproached herself for overlooking it? And strangely, though she should be, Cecilia did not feel angry at her at all. "Are you angry with me?" asked Hermione tentatively, when Cecilia had said anything in response to her apology. Cecilia shook her head. "No," she replied truthfully, sighing deeply as she looked randomly around her room, before back at Hermione. "That explains why Ron has been thanking me for my advice over the last few months." "Is there anything I can do to make it up?" asked Hermione, the tone of her voice seemingly requesting of Cecilia some form of admonishment. "I think you have a lot of explaining to do, to Ron," Cecilia replied, getting to her feet. At her reply, Hermione lowered her head before nodding erratically. Cecilia got to her feet. Right, well, now that was sorted out, perhaps she could believe that was the start of a role, and that all the problems she set her mind to that day would also be solved as easily. She made her way towards the door, intending to open it and usher the girl out, but as she went, Cecilia saw Hermione's head drop and she exhaled silently. The rest of it would wait. Her student needed her unrushed attention now. "You don't enjoy being at school, do you?" asked Cecilia, smiling at Hermione as she made her way over to her. Hermione looked at her quickly, her teary eyes wide in astonishment. "You feel you have something to prove?" "Yes," said Hermione, nodding. "Yes." Cecilia agreed. She looked down slowly, and moved her gaze slowly across the flagstone floor, her feet following as she looked up towards the window. Glancing back at the hunched figure of Hermione, she returned to the window, examining the grain of the wood that framed the grey-toned glass as her stomach dropped to achingly towards her feet. "I could easily be a child here." Her mind drifted through her memories as she worked her way up the frame and her voice took on a faraway tone. After Christmas, the castle was empty. It was truly wonderful to research. The process of researching all these mysterious things. She glanced at Hermione briefly. "Think of the things you find most fascinating and fantastic about science, Hermione. And for me, with magic. See the books I have read, with personalities of their own. The pictures that talk and move. The invisibility cloak that belongs to one or other of you. I even came across a strange mirror hidden in an underground room." "What did you see, Mrs. Frobisher?" asked Hermione, quickly. "Nothing," said Cecilia, looking back at her. "There was nothing there, not even my reflection or the walls behind me, which was very peculiar. If I had more time to investigate such things in the castle, I would be a very satisfied scientist." She walked back over the floor and looked at Hermione. "But I am far too arrogant, Hermione. I thought when I began this, if my world can be described by science, then this one can too. I can apply universal laws of physics to magic, and the chemical nature to potions, and the biological nature of genetics to wizards. I can do that, I thought. I have the determination. Understanding. Skill." She opened up her notebook from where Hermione had put it on her dressing table, and turned to a page near the front, pointing at a relevant passage. "Elemental nature of impedimenta." She continued to pace towards her reverse-faced wardrobe. "Energy of Axio, Felix Felicis, Reparo. The wave function of the Cursula Humera, Expelliarmus Avada Kedavra." She glanced at Hermione, who was staring at her, before glancing back at her notebook. "I know I'm not the one to sort this out," she said, pacing back to the book, flicking it shut and concentrating on it, a look filled with all of her personal inadequacies and limitations. "I cannot look at things with as critical an eye as a wizard, who has grown up with it. Neither can a wizard, who knows nothing of mole science, understand to such a great degree the importance of the physical nature of the world." Picking up the book, she threw it onto the bed, watching with growing hopelessness as it bounced a couple of times against the pillow before spilling onto the floor with a thump. "You and Professor Snape," began Hermione, with care in her voice. "Why did he do this?" exclaimed Cecilia, clenching her fists in frustration. "He just left. Why would anyone be so callous just to walk out? Without a word. After what we had." Cecilia could feel herself blushing, with no real explanation. tears began to fall down her cheeks now as she turned away from Hermione and walked towards the window again. I must be so naive. This time, it was Hermione who waited for her to speak. She remained seated, watching in sympathy as Mrs. Frobisher's clearly involuntary release of her bottled-up feelings in her presence, clumsily and bluntly, unrefined and raw. There's nothing left for me here. Severus. The one person who I can talk to. He's injured so badly it will be a miracle if he speaks again. And I caused that. Hermione. Me. Cecilia clenched her fists again, making her knuckles whiten under the pressure because of my pride. This is what I'm causing, Hermione, by being here. And I can't even recompense by being able to guarantee that the potion we are making will be perfect. Her gaze caught Hermione's eye and she sighed, shaking her head at her own weakness and crossed back to her bed, looking angrily at her inadequate notebook. I apologize, Hermione, Cecilia said eventually, her teacherly tone returning, that you had to listen to the rantings of a mad woman. I would appreciate it if you would not repeat anything to your friends. Hermione looked down, as her own reality weighed on her shoulders once more. I don't know how long they will be friends, said Hermione glumly. When Ron tells Harry, they won't have much to say to me. And when he tells Ginny. And the twins, they think you're so cool, Mrs. Frobisher, they'll be as mad as anything. She shook her head sadly. What is the promise you wish to make? Not to tell the MC. Professor McGonagall, said Hermione, glancing down in shame. She would have no choice but to expel me, not least for using the potion to impersonate someone, which is against school rules, and for deceiving and also stealing the ingredients. Cecilia nodded. I see. Yes. Of course not, Hermione. However, you will have to deal with Ron. Hermione nodded, and got to her feet. Thank you, Mrs. Frobisher, she said, looking down, before holding out a hand. For understanding. Cecilia shook her head, and stood up too. Not in the least, replied Cecilia, standing up. I should be flattered that a young lady such as yourself considered impersonating me to be something of value. It is I who should be thanking you for understanding. She reached towards her necklace that she had lent Hermione for the ball, before dropping her hand sharply. It really suits you. Mrs. Frobisher. Did it bring you luck? Hermione paused, before nodding. Cecilia smiled inwardly and the young witch made to take it off. Keep it. I'll never wear it again. Now, if you'll excuse me. Hermione nodded again and walked towards the door. Cecilia turned and looked towards the bathroom, wondering whether Dobby would have run her a bath or if it would be a strip wash over the sink. Mrs. Frobisher, said Hermione, leaning through the door as Cecilia placed a hand on the oak of the bathroom door. I left the potion there. It's the one half of it. You can't make the second half until you need it, and the first half takes a month. My contribution to your research, she added, shyly. And if you need me to make any more, or change it, or anything, you only have to ask. Thank you, Hermione, said Cecilia, nodding at the girl. She waited until the young witch had finally closed the door of her room before hurrying gracelessly into the bathroom and throwing it shut behind her. 88,888,888. In a stately manner, far away from Hogwarts, the events of early that morning were being subjectively analyzed by the followers of Lord Voldemort. The main protagonist, charged with their orchestration, evaluated the results. It is done. It is done, she repeated. By the old magic. But the mole was not Cecilia Frobisher. She wheeled round and pointed a long, slim finger in Lucius Malfoy's direction malevolently. You did not perform the old magic correctly, Bellatrix, he replied, his body stiff and motionless. Is that what you are telling us? He remained fixed as Bellatrix Lestrange took a furious step in his direction, screaming in fury. The name your son gave was false and the location was also inaccurate. The magic will only work with the proper information, Lucius. As well you know. Rodolphus Lestrange put a hand on his wife's shoulder to prevent her flying at their host. They were all disappointed at the results of the early morning, and though moles were destroyed, it hadn't been their lord's intended target. Everyone was on edge at the contemplation of his impending retribution. We received the message from the mole's own hand, Bella. Narcissa Malfoy stepped towards her sister, attempting a layer of reason as lubricant between her husband's stubbornness and Bellatrix's rage. We acted on the information we had. Bellatrix ignored her sister's diplomatic intervention and the tightening grip of her husband's hand on her shoulder, taking the book, almost identical to the one in which Cecilia had written the letter to Snape, and she scrutinized the message suspiciously. She was clever enough not to say where she was going, Lucius. How were you unable to interpret that she was to return to her home? It is the same as the information that you were unable to retrieve from the Ministry a month ago. Hustian and Doyle falling far short of Dash. But the mole that was there. Malfoy snapped. Elizabeth Mitchell. Was a mole. In the house. As were the others there. His voice trailed off and his gaze became fixed on the figure that had materialized behind his sister-in-law, under the Gothic arch that separated the parlor from the study. How did he manage that, when the room was imperturbable? Your conversation makes interesting listening. Voldemort moved slowly, as if skimming over the floor, rather than walking. And to answer your question, Lucius, because I am the most powerful wizard who ever lived. Voldemort proceeded towards the group, who took steps back in order for him to enter the circle of them. Many of them felt apprehension at his sudden uninvited arrival, others such as Pettigrew and Bellatrix, felt heartened. They had not knowingly or incompetently betrayed their master. You have done well, Bellatrix. I can see, as ever, you acted in good faith, on inaccurate information. He swung his head towards Lucius, as did many of the Death Eaters. Even though they had retreated to Malfoy's mansion, many felt that Lucius Malfoy had played on and used his blood ties to extricate himself from less fragrant tasks for far too long. She fought, my lord, the mole that we found, replied Bellatrix proudly, showing off her scarred forearms. I overcame her, of course. For, in the end, a weak mole she confirmed herself to be. And Dolohov. I understand we are to thank for your contribution. He looked at the confused Death Eater and growled low in annoyance at his follower's ignorance. You dispatched the mole's husband. Yes, my lord. The Death Eater bowed at the waist. As ever your servant. Voldemort could not hide his delight at the confirmation. He curled his upper lip in amusement. Painfully, I trust. Of course, Dolohov nodded. Cruciatus, followed by Avada Kedavra. Good. He nodded in congratulation. Then he turned to Lucius Malfoy, who, in the beautiful trappings of familiar surroundings, was caught off guard. You, on the other hand, your information was, as Bellatrix describes, inaccurate. It is curious to wonder why two pieces of information were coincidentally erroneous. However, the result remains. The mole lives, and as such, the enemy's plan rolls ever forward. Malfoy held Voldemort's gaze for only a second longer before dropping to his knees. That he did that so in his own house, before the portraits of his forebears, was unheard of. As one, the Death Eaters drew breath sharply. My lord, I was given it on the authority of Dash. Your son? Hissed Voldemort icily. Whose deeds on my behalf seem to have always been somewhat short of the mark. Do not rely on the evidence of your son again, Lucius, for I will not. At the humiliating denunciation, Malfoy hung his head lower, so he was staring at the rich, Tyrannian carpet which luxuriously hugged the floorboards. But my lord, he continued, he was acting as best as he could, under the circumstances. He gained his information. Silence. Voldemort withdrew his wand and pointed it at Malfoy. Half of the Death Eaters inhaled sharply again, one or two, beneath their masks, grinned mercilessly. Bella. He turned swiftly and held the wand at arm's length in her direction. I did I not, entrust the task to your overseeing? The terror in his favorite's eyes flashed bright and clear. Bellatrix clearly did not expect to be the one receiving Voldemort's wrath. You did, my lord, she said, her voice failing to waver, even before him. And I failed you. The mole that was not the one who left Hogwarts, who I was assigned to kill. She bowed her head obediently. Bellatrix, you are my most loyal follower. Voldemort's voice was light and almost sing-song as he addressed her, and he lowered his wand at the same time. However, I ask you, how will I command the loyalty of others if I do not punish those who have failed me? As his voice tailed off, he raised his wand, and blue-white sparks flew out of it, forcing Bellatrix Lestrange onto her knees. A scream reverberated around the study, bouncing off the ornaments and books. Wow! Narcissa Malfoy turned to her husband and screamed at him. How could you not check with Draco? Why did you not make sure? She pointed towards her sister, whose teeth were gritted in agony as she bore Voldemort's torture in silence. I did what I could, screamed back Lucius, staggering back to his feet and glaring at his wife. I trusted our son. Before Narcissa could reply, Bellatrix's screams reverberated around the study, shaking the huge portraits of the Malfoy family that hung on the walls and drawing their attention, and those of their ancestors, back to her plight. Then Voldemort lowered his wand. I did not wish to do that. His voice echoed in the silent aftermath of his torture of Bellatrix Lestrange. None will doubt that equally as I reward success, I punish failure. Let no one doubt it. For a few moments, no one spoke. Some Death Eaters, including Narcissa Malfoy, looked in Bellatrix's direction, empathizing with her plight. Others looked away or at the floor. None dared look at their lord directly, and all waited for him to take the lead. Long have you suffered, my loyal followers, Voldemort said, at length. Long have you endured ignobility and reprehensible conditions as you endeavored to avail yourselves of your duties to me. I salute you, my supporters. He looked round at each of them in turn, including Bellatrix, who was still on her knees. I salute each and every one of you for the afflictions you have borne as you have endeavored to eradicate this land, nay, this world, of moles. Do you know why moles today are more repugnant than ever? Around Voldemort, the Death Eaters stared at their master, shaking their heads in mute ignorance. Long have they contaminated the earth. Long have they destroyed it. Exploitation of natural resources. Pollution. Annihilation of the natural world. For the last 200 years moles have done these things in the pursuit of power, to gain energy to warm themselves, feed themselves, support a never-spawning population. They have ransacked this planet as if it was theirs alone to plunder. Voldemort paused. Every pair of eyes were on him now, none were expecting him to speak in this manner, and he held them in rapt awe. Moles would have died out of their own accord had they not chosen the path of power. This would have resulted in the world being inhabited by magical beings, using energy responsibly and efficiently. The world would have been a true wonder of purity to occupy. But such a dream is now gone. We have a planet that is in danger of boiling from the pollution created by these filth-loving moles. Not only do we have a natural, righteous urge to destroy moles, but a moral one too. Voldemort looked around his supporters again, who were now looking at one another, muttering to each other. He smiled slowly as the low noise buzz amongst them suggested that they were in agreement. As the noise grew steadily, Lucius Malfoy stepped towards the center of the group. My lord. The noise diminished, and the topic of conversation appeared to shift to focus on the host of the meeting. My lord, he repeated, clearly waiting for Voldemort's permission to speak, and he nodded slightly in Malfoy's direction. We have it on good authority, My lord, continued Lucius, his volume increasing to match his confidence. The weapon is ever closer to being developed. Even though it is designed to be used by Harry Potter himself, it will not be substantial enough. At present, so we are informed, they do not have the correct construct, and even if they do find a way, Snape, he glanced sideways at Bellatrix, informed us that the Mole will not allow it to be used by him. How interesting that you come by that source of information, Lucius, said Voldemort, staring icily at Malfoy. Was it particularly difficult for you to extract that information from Severus Snape? He followed Lucius Malfoy's line of sight, and stared at his former favorite. And did you not consider, Bellatrix, that Snape would have imparted this information to me of his own accord, without the need for convincing? Bellatrix gave Lucius a sour look, folding her arms in resentment. However, the information is in itself intriguing. Dumbledore trusts the Mole enough to use the boy, and yet her weak mind will not allow her to fulfill what the great man requires for fear it will injure him. An expression of mocking played on Voldemort's features. Interesting. He looked back at Malfoy. Did Snape inform you of any other information, Lucius? Malfoy shook his head slowly. Only that he wished to confirm that once we had finished interrogating the Mole, what remained was his. At this, a ripple of comments flitted between the Death Eaters. And what of Avery? He turned quickly to the subject least favored Death Eater, and, at his name, many of them visibly shuddered and looked away. One who did not, however, was Bellatrix. She stepped forward, clearly eager to win back her image as his most faithful by sharing the least palatable information with the Dark Lord. From his father's information, it would seem that for many years he worked for Ongman. Lully appears to have the details well hidden. Avery himself fled last night. I organized the search party. McNair, Crabbe, Rabastan, not. All will recommence until he is found. Bellatrix inclined her head, anticipating her master's commendation. Voldemort stepped forward, raising his wand again. She gasped in horror, wondering what she had got so wrong that she must endure his displeasure a second time that evening. However, Voldemort did not direct his wand towards the Death Eater, but held it aloft, in the center of the circle. Good. He declared, glowering at the accomplishments of some of his followers. But the fact remains, I still need the book, wherever it is. However, it is a minor inconvenience. But my lord, said Lucius Malfoy, addressing Voldemort directly this time, the mission to the Mole's house was intended to avail you of it. Indeed, Lucius. And there is one loyal supporter who will track it down for me. This time, Fenrir Greyback will not fail me again. 88,888,888. Each day for 4 days since Hagrid had brought Snape up to the hospital wing, Cecilia spent every free minute at his bedside. Following her chance meeting with Hermione as herself, she proceeded to use a set of notes that Snape had inserted into her notebook, completed 2 batches, before teaching lessons. As it was a Friday, she had lower school, and only in the afternoon, which reassured Cecilia. Despite Dumbledore's reassurances that none of the students in her 5th-year classes would remember what had gone on, she nonetheless would have felt awkward having to teach them immediately. Then she analyzed the batches, having readjusted the instruments carefully before recording the results and making her way up to the hospital wing, where she spent the evening evaluating the results at Snape's bedside. On that first evening, Cecilia was not very productive. Poppy Pomfrey brought her a chair and she sat next to Snape, looking over her results, but her mind drifted to the conversation she had heard the previous evening that had led to his horrific injuries, running over and over the main events of that night and morning in her mind. Poppy had explained that it may take a few days before he regained consciousness, and she had ushered her out of the hospital when the clock had struck midnight, telling her that there was little of substance that Cecilia could actually do. Over the weekend, Snape began to stir, and she took it upon herself to discuss the potions she had made and analyzed during the day, including him in the evaluation process, as if he was conscious, even putting across her side of the argument, as if anticipating where he would choose to interject, correcting him one-sidedly as she got through the analysis. It was on the fourth evening that Cecilia noticed him stir and open his eyes. She had dropped her book heavily onto the floor when she noticed him move, and at Poppy Pomfrey's behest had left for a long, tortuous hour, until the healer had come to find her, assuring her that Snape was conscious if very weak. Cecilia had bolted along the second floor and through the double-hinged doors of the room in which the wizard lay, her heart stopping momentarily when she saw that his eyes were closed once more. Carefully, Cecilia sat by his bed, and took his hand, gently. At her touch, he opened his dark eyes slowly and Cecilia smiled. Then she noticed her research book open on the table next to the bed on her last day's work. "Kickler," he managed, through dry, cracked lips. "Cecilia." He shuffled up in the bed, looking across at her in a glower, dropping her hand as he did so. "Good to see you, Severus," she said quietly, folding her arms across her chest. "Same could be said for you," he retorted quickly, before wincing. "I thought it would be foolish for any male to return to the castle when a student issued death threats." His eyes narrowed, and Cecilia felt her heart stop. Not only had she been the cause of his suffering, he hated her for leaving, for collecting the samples, too. "However," he continued, his voice still cracked and reedy, "I have witnessed that weak trait of bravery in you before, Cecilia. I trust you managed to retrieve everything we desired?"